Okay, so this is a presentation called Gia, the supermodel, an example of an intense symbiosis. And I had two reasons in mind for putting together this presentation. I think that it shows a nice contrast between how attachment theory conceptualizes a problem and how Bowen theory conceptualizes a problem. And also, I think that it shows an interesting way to understand addictions from a Bowen theory perspective. So I'm going to come back to both of those theoretical rationales at the end of the presentation. So a lot of the material for this has come from this book, which I recommend to people. It's called Thing of Beauty by Stephen Fried. It came out in 1993. And my oldest daughter actually turned me on to it, and she thought I would appreciate it, and she was right. So here is the family of Gia. Here is her father, Joe. His father was an immigrant from Italy who worked as a jeweler and was called the Mister because of his autocratic ways. His mother, there's not much information about her except that she died in the mid-60s. So that would have been in the early years of the marriage that produced Gia. Joe was in World War II. When he came back, he started getting into bread delivery with his twin brother, Dan. And then he got into restaurant and chains of sandwich shops. He was always a soft touch for a job or a loan that he knew would never be repaid. He supported many relatives who worked in the business, including his brother Dan, who often incurred gambling debts. His first marriage ended in divorce because he was, quotes, too young. That's all the information that I've ever been able to find about that. He was a small, jocular man. Now, Kathleen, the mother, her father was Irish and a machinist. He was in the Navy. Her mother was a Welsh and very fundamentalist religious beliefs, strict beliefs. Kathleen rejected her mother's beliefs. She had a lot of conflict with her, and she had a distant and conflictual relationship with her and with her older sister. Her next younger sister, Barbara, was more of a buffer and interceded in her relationships. She was a big boned teenager, chubby with thick glasses. She joined a modeling club at a local department store and appeared on TV for a few times while modeling. After graduation, she worked at an exclusive shop selling clothes and preparing fashion shows. She loved fashion, but she was especially fascinated by working with the models. Her parents initially objected to the marriage, ostensibly because Joe was older and he looked like her dad. After her marriage, she was content, in 56, she was content to be a wife and homemaker, saying, "It's an important job. If you failed at that, you failed at being a woman." Joe and Kathleen rapidly had their first two children, Joe Jr., called Joey, born in 57, and then Michael, born in 58. Here's a picture of Joe and Kathleen with Joey in 1958. So he would be around a year. I guess he's a year. There's one candle in that cake. Now, Gia was born in 1960. She was to be the last child, the little girl to whom Kathleen could pass the mantle of womanhood. Kathleen says, quote, "I just wanted her. When the boys were born on one of the first trips we had to the doctor for the regular checkups, he said to me, quotes, 'Kiss them goodbye now. Eventually was the one I could put it all into because she was a girl. I wouldn't be accused of making a sissy out of her or whatever. Maybe I held on to her too tightly, so I was able to let go of the boys a little bit," unquote. Until her parents divorced, Gia was her mother's child in every way, often sleeping with her and liking to stay in the house with her. She would say, "My mother is my best friend." She was encouraged to talk baby talk long after it was appropriate. She was a bright, quiet, shy child, but bratty. She wet the bed long past infancy. Her brattiness would be examples. She would get lost on purpose when they were out in public. She would pull the stop on the escalator switch while they were out in public. She was the focus of much motherly attention. Here's Gia as a young Brownie Scout. But she rebelled against it. She yanked out the ribbons her mother braided into her hair. Her hair wasn't cut except for the bangs till she was 8. Then her mother had the hair washed, rebraided, and saved. She rejected out of hand what her mother tried to teach her about how to think and behave. For example, Kathleen would say, "You want a big boyfriend to protect you." And Gia would say, "I'll protect him." Joe was more comfortable with the boys and teased the girls. So you have this kind of picture with an intense relationship between Kathleen and Gia, Joe more distant. And as the kids got older, the marital conflict increased. Kathleen and Joe brought out the worst in each other. The problems in the household were exaggerated rather than constructively addressed. Joe took the family on nice vacations, gave them nice things, but mostly worked very long hours. I'm showing that with the kind of distance arrow. Kathleen wanted Joe's success and stability, but also his constant understanding and attention, which he wasn't able to give. She wanted help raising the children and keeping the house. It was as if she wanted motherhood to be a 9-to-5 job with vacations. Joe didn't see these activities as part of his job description. He didn't think the kids should do any work. For example, setting the table was mommy's job. Kathleen wasn't functioning well. Son Joe recalls that the kids were caring for themselves a lot and Kathleen was in bed and out of the house. Kathleen was shrill, lecturing, and making dramatic exits. Sometimes she would storm out with Gia riding the L until she calmed down. She also left with the kids for a day or two. Joe got physical, and so did Kathleen. So I'm showing this family emotional process. Kathleen, very over-involved, inconsistent and indulgent with Gia. Joe, indulgent, permissive, rescuing, distant, and critical, and the escalating physical stuff and emotional conflict between them. Joe was very jealous. Police were called to the house. He once smacked Kathleen in the face during sex and accused her of thinking of someone else. Kathleen, on the other hand, thought every man was in love with her. She once approached Dan, her brother-in-law, verbally about making him. At one point, Joe tried to examine Kathleen to see if she had had sex with someone else. At that point, she made a suicide attempt. Joe sat and watched her taking the pills, thinking she was just being dramatic. When she got sleepy, he called the police and she was hospitalized. Kathleen had a psychiatric hospitalization after a female in her bowling group came on to her. Kathleen finally came to believe if she didn't leave, one of them would kill the other. She saw leaving the kids behind as the only way to get out, that Joe would never let her take them. So, in February of 1971, she convinced Joe she had to get out for her sanity. He helped her to arrange an apartment. When she left, he wasn't aware that it was for keeps. He was devastated when he realized it was permanent. The divorce was bitter. Joe rarely kept to the schedule or the amounts of child support. His siblings and parents helped him to care for the kids, but he was gone a lot from the home and there was no one there to help. His home became an unsupervised place to hang out for the brothers and their friends. Kathleen says, Gia might have been all right, but then, I don't know, maybe if I hadn't left her father, it could have worked out all right. I only know what went on in my mind. When I left, she held on to being that 11-year-old girl emotionally. Within a month of moving out, Kathleen met, in March of 1971, Henry Spur and moved in with him. He was a socially active, separated financial consultant who swept her off of her feet. So they began living together. They married in March of 72. Excuse me. Soon after the marriage, Kathleen announced that she wanted another child. Henry was negative, and Kathleen settled for Gia moving in with them. So Gia moves in with Henry and Kathleen. Gia also maintained a bedroom in her father's house, the family home. She played her parents off against each other and moved back and forth between the two houses at will. She blamed Henry for causing her parents' breakup. For his part, Henry tried disciplining Gia occasionally, but mainly stayed out of it and was critical. Kathleen was unable to discipline Gia. She was inconsistent with no follow-through. As a friend of Gia's said, Kathleen was more tolerant than any parent should be in trying to hold on to her kids' love. Gia learned very early what she could get away with. When you have people around you who can tell, jump backwards through a hoop of fire, and they do it, pretty soon you find yourself becoming a really overbearing bastard. And then you have to make a conscious decision to be less abusive. That's the end of the quote from Gia's friend. As a teenager, Gia hung out with an older crowd, tried to fit in, and often wooed girls. She rarely shared any personal details with anyone. Even her closest relationships were shallow. Kathleen, who searched Gia's room often, once found a letter to a girl Gia had written. She took Gia to a therapist. In a session, Gia came out to her mother as gay. Gia became a David Bowie freak, attracted to his themes of alienation, androgyny, and otherworldliness. When she cut her hair Bowie style, Kathleen had such a reaction that she avoided Gia for 2 weeks. However, she would also go to Bowie concerts with Gia to try and understand. Gia became close friends with Karen Carusa, a bright girl who wore outrageous clothes, doesn't look too outrageous in this picture, and reminded Gia of a famous Bowie groupie. Gia partied heavily in gay South Philly clubs, often with her aunt Nancy Adams. This is the youngest sister in Kathleen's family. Kathleen was always afraid of Nancy's involvement with Gia. Nancy and Gia were close. Gia drank, smoked pot, and took Quaaludes. Michael, one of the better pot connections in Philadelphia, supplied her. The girls were very close and open with each other. Kathleen told Gia's details of her relationships with Joe, her suicide attempt, and her psychiatric hospitalization. Gia told Kathleen of her sexual abuse by a neighbor when she was 6. Kathleen and Henry were out often by themselves. So back to the family diagram. They bought a cabin in the Poconos where they threw wild parties and were often gone for the weekend. Kathleen was using diet pills, tranquilizers, and Quaaludes herself. In 1974, Gia called Karen Carusa saying she wanted to leave home because Henry was, quotes, bothering her. She wanted Henry and Kathleen to break up and Joe and Kathleen to reconcile. Henry, Kathleen, and Gia went for therapy. The therapist honed in on Gia, thinking he was going to get her to spill her guts. Instead, she ran out of the session and moved in with her father and her two brothers, her father's new wife, and her four boys. That's this unit over here. Joe's second wife and her sons and the two brothers. In 1974, Joe Petrellis, a friend of Kathleen's and Henry's, did a test shooting of Gia. So she is 14 in this picture. She took a modeling course with Nancy, who was also interested in modeling and fashion. Around the same time, she also began shoplifting and stealing credit cards, being daring and dauntless. An older hairdresser friend observed, quotes, Gia had the kind of personality that yielded to a babysitter sometimes. She needed guidance, whether a mother, a lover, a sister, or a nanny. She needed not to be left alone, and the person she really wanted was her mother. Kathleen obviously wanted her own life and wanted her daughter to be strong enough to do it on her own without Kathleen doing anything. End of quote. Gia moved back in with Kathleen and Henry when their stepmother became pregnant, and she missed her friends in North Philly. Kathleen tried to be more strict, beginning drug testing for cocaine. I get a kick out of being more strict, being associated with drug testing. Kathleen took Gia to a modeling agency where she did most of the talking. Gia began working as a model in Philly. She was always late. Gia's modeling allowed Kathleen to vicariously live the life that Kathleen had wanted and confirmed Gia's femininity. Kathleen saw Gia trapped in a man-woman body. When Gia became involved in an intense lesbian relationship with a woman-female, Sharon, Kathleen called the older woman's mother and put an end to it. In high school, Gia struggled to pass the basic courses. She had a short attention span. In the 70s, she finished her junior year in high school after having moved back and forth between her parents several more times. When the going got tight in one place, she went to the other. Now, isn't this a clever thing? When she was 16, her father bought her a car. Kathleen and Joe agreed to let her move to Center City, Philadelphia, to live over one of the hoagie shops with Michael, her brother, the best pot collection in Philadelphia. Gia had no goals. Modeling was the career that vaguely interested her and the only one she knew her mother would approve. Having Petrellis shoot her photo and doing department store ads were among the few things she had done that pleased Kathleen. In 77, she's 17 now, Maurice Tenenbaum, a hairdresser and photographer, approached Gia at a club. He photographed her, and this is the photograph, part of that photograph, and through his connections, arranged a visit to the agency of Wilhelmina Models in New York City. He and Gia went up to the office while Kathleen waited below in the coffee shop. This is a poster of Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina was a very successful model, and when she was aging out of modeling, she started her own agency. She was pretty well known in the 70s. Wilhelmina was extremely enthusiastic and signed Gia immediately. Gia was one of the few models who were Wilhelmina's pet projects and were run. Can somebody please mute their audio? We're getting other audio in here. In February, please mute your audio.
Okay.
I muted you. In February of 1978, at 18, Gia moved to New York City, living with Sharon, her former lover, as just friends.
Bye.
Please keep your audio muted. She began the rounds of go-sees where models visit photographers with their portfolios looking for work. She was very awed and influenced by Wilhelmina, saying, "I finally found a mother." The head of Wilhelmina's women's division remarked, quote, "She was like a puppy, like someone who needed love." She had little contact with others at the agency besides Wilhelmina. She had a meteoric rise in the modeling world in a few short months. She landed jobs at Harper's Bazaar and work in Rome and Milan for the fashion shows. Here's an early Armani ad with a picture of her. She didn't get a realistic picture of the business, where a few successes usually come after some amount of starving time. Gia herself said, quotes, "I didn't build into a model, I just became one." And here's a year early, this is a famous fashion photographer of the time, Lance Stadler, that shot this picture. As Freed, the author of the book, notes, only 10 or 15 girls since the mid-70s have made it to Gia's level, the supermodel level. One friend observed, quotes, "One of the worst things that happened to Gia was that she became successful. The last thing in the world that girl needed was to be indulged, and she was indulged constantly." End of the quote. She also became one of the darlings of, here, for example, here's Gia and a Bazaar publisher in Capri on a shoot, cavorting. Gia also, this is a poster from the famous Studio 54 in New York City, and this is supposed to be a spoonful of cocaine. She was one of the darlings of the fast-living, drug-using crowd at Studio 54. In her travels for shoots, she lived hard and attracted attention. Noblemen proposed and took her on fabulous trips. When she moved to New York City, for example, here's her apartment and Gia, and this is she. And Ingrid, I need you to keep your audio muted. You are interrupting the webcast, please. So this appeared in a magazine, and you can see the sort of level of focus on her. As Stephen Freed writes, quote, "At some level, the entire fashion industry is built on a shifting foundation, people falling in and out of love with each other personally and professionally. Every photo shoot is like a one-night stand. So many fashionistas are runaways, leaving where they grew up with no intent of ever going back. The fashion world is its own huge dysfunctional family." Gia described being in front of a camera as magical. She could be whatever she wanted. One observer of the fashion scene opined that when you scratch the surface of the fashion world, you get more surface. Gia was in constant contact with Kathleen by phone. She came to visit New York once in response to Gia's demands that she do her laundry. Kathleen reports constant demands and said, quote, "She was hard to say no to. She knew she could get me to do anything she wanted," end quote. Kathleen described Gia as, quote, "good to me, very thoughtful, and taking care of me," end quote. She was very excited about Gia's career, very into it. At this point in Gia's career, a lot of her work was given to her by the Bazaar fashion director, Lisette Catan. She gave her a lot of her first major jobs. Gia tried to get Lisette to mother her, and Lisette was willing. Lisette Catan commented that Gia was not able to maintain relationships spent a lot of time by herself, and had real difficulty with people. In January 1979, Gia got her first cover for Italian Vogue, and in the same month, she got this cover for the British Vogue. However, at work, her attitude was often uncooperative, oppositional, angry, and rebellious. She was the James Dean of models, intense, brooding, and vulnerable. Still, she was used by many designers and magazines. Already at a shoot in December, she had fallen asleep and drugs were suspected. She fought with Sharon and they split. Gia did a famous shoot with a fashion photographer, Chris von Wagenheim, and this was the fashion photo for it. And then he did an art photo of her after he finished the fashion shooting. During this shoot, the makeup artist, was Sandy Lintner, and Gia became very infatuated with her. She had a tempestuous relationship with Sandy. Gia fell hard, fast, and often in love. She moved in rapidly and intensely on her latest flame, making extremely unrealistic demands and therefore was often unhappy. She had no boundaries. Gia was now communicating less to Kathleen, and as that happened, drugs and drug-connected relationships were increasing. By the summer of 1979, some were routinely booking a backup model for her shoots because of her no-shows and being so late. It's a picture of her strung out on her heroin. And at that point in time, there was this phrase, heroin chic. People thought doing heroin was chic. In the late 70s, she began snorting heroin and loved it. Michael visited her in New York City during '79, but he didn't realize she wanted him to move in with her and be there with her. He was the only family member with an early inkling of her drug problems, but then he had them himself. In January of 1980, Wilhelmina Cooper was hospitalized and diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. Few of the other models were as invested in the relationship with Wilhelmina as Gia. Wilhelmina died March 1st, 1980, and Gia was devastated. Her drug use increased and she began shooting heroin. Her work and contacts with friends and professional associates decreased. She had a $2,000 to $3,000 a day habit, and overdoses were not unusual. She had developed an abscess on her left hand from shooting heroin. She haunted the low-life sections of town, buying and using and shooting alleys. Her relationship with Sandy Lintner was definitely over. Sandy wouldn't take her calls. She went back to Philadelphia and she became friends with a rich bad girl. This is Gia closer and her friend Rochelle in the background. Rochelle had been indulged by her young, wealthy parents. And Rochelle will reappear through the coming months and years. Here is a photo by Francisco Scavullo, who was a famous fashion photographer, when even the airbrushing couldn't erase all the tracks on her arms. However, despite all this picture, here we are in August of '80, and she gets a Vogue cover. So she's still getting high-level jobs, even though she's not functioning very well at all. No one tried to tell Kathleen and Henry what was going on. While Wilhelmina was alive, the agency didn't perceive the relationship with Gia's parents as strong enough to help. Wilhelmina was the only one with an inkling of Gia's relationship with Kathleen. When she died, others accepted Gia's view that she was estranged from her broken family. In the fall of 1980, Kathleen came to New York City to help Gia move. She saw Gia's professional setbacks as a product of industry jealousies and that Gia needed help. Gia had left many of her belongings in her last apartment. Kathleen saw that as the prerogative of a famous person. Kathleen had become Gia's greatest groupie instead of a mother. Eventually, Kathleen did learn of the heroin use and said, quotes, "I don't think I could have felt any worse than if I were doing the heroin myself. This theme will come up again later. Kathleen did confront Gia with the drug usage in December of '80, which created a lot of upsets. In February of 1981, this is Kathleen with pictures of Gia in her house, just to indicate how into Gia's career she was. She had this wall where she put the covers that Gia had on the wall. In February, Gia moved back to Philly with Kathleen and Henry and did a 21-day detox program. She expressed worries about her mother living vicariously through her career, and she asked Kathleen to take down all those frame covers. In March of 1981, needless to say, Kathleen didn't. In March of '81, Gia was arrested in Philadelphia on a DWI, high on cocaine and alcohol. This is her mugshot. Her parents arranged an expensive attorney for the court hearing, and Gia didn't even show up for the hearing, having gone on a shoot. Her brothers and father had moved to Atlantic City, and she stayed distant from them. Her Aunt Nancy distanced from her as she couldn't handle it. Gia robbed Kathleen of jewelry, and Kathleen and Henry swore out a warrant. In New York, she went back to New York. A friend, Tony O'Connor, took her in, but then she began abusing Tony's things at a time when Tony was supporting Gia financially. Finally, Tony threw her out. Gia went back to Philly, did another drug program with an outpatient methadone maintenance focus. In the fall of 1981, Gia tried a New York comeback. She signed with the Elite Modeling Agency. The head of that agency, Monique Pollard, tried to be a mother figure. There's a pattern here you might notice, saying what she was looking for was the mother she had lost in Wilhelmina. Elite had a history of not confronting models about drugs. Kathleen turned it over to Elite, sure if Gia's career was successful, that the problems would go away. Gia had a real challenge in trying to make a comeback. She was going to have to deal with the rigors of rejection that she had jumped over the first time. Francisco Scavula, gave her a Cosmo cover. Here it is. Interestingly, he had always been able to work with her. Now, many thought that he put her arms behind her back in this shoot because of her drug use, but he denied her. He denied that that was what happened. He also published a book and included her in this book. It was called Scavula Women. And in that book, Gia says, it wasn't a matter of stopping. It was wanting to live in the world I live in and make it work for me instead of against me. I'm an extremist, you know. I had to go all the way. I was really spoiled, you know. I was a brat, but it isn't easy to say no. Basically, I'm a satisfier. Gia was commuting to New York City, living with Rochelle when in Philadelphia. But then by December 1981, she was back with Kathleen. In April 82, she had a new apartment in New York City. The 2020 show did an interview with her asking about her supposedly past drug use while she looked stoned. In 1982 and into 83, she kept moving back and forth between New York and Philly and continuing this torrid affair with Rochelle. Kathleen visited a lot. When she came, Rochelle would disappear. Kathleen blamed Rochelle for corrupting Gia, and Rochelle blamed Kathleen for not loving her enough and giving her enough attention when she was a child. Excuse me a second. My voice is a little rocky today. I'm going to take a sip. Rochelle describes visiting Gia's family. Kathleen would treat them well or poorly, depending on how well Gia's modeling was going. Rochelle was using also, but she was attending X-ray technician school. She had a focus. Gia was spending up to $10,000 a day on heroin. People in the business would pay her in drugs. They had difficulty covering up her drug use in the photographs. She was caught using drugs on a shoot in North Africa and spent packing. In spring 1983, Gia left New York City for the last time. Her modeling career was over. She was frozen out. She stayed with Kathleen, who feared for Gia's life and was profoundly disappointed in her career. She enrolled in another methadone program, but stopped going after a while. Kathleen, who needed cataract surgery, pushed Gia out, concerned about her own stress level as she faced the surgery. Then she tried to stop Gia moving out, a typical emotional flip-flop of their relationship. But Gia did leave, and in the fall of '83, she went to Atlantic City, where her father, her uncle, and her brothers were, and she got Rochelle to join her. Rochelle was working doing nails. Gia wanted a stable relationship with Rochelle, but she didn't know how to get there, and she was very jealous. Several months after the move, Kathleen came to visit. The first face-to-face contact in 6 months. Gia was pouty about Kathleen not letting her live with her. Kathleen said, "Don't you understand? I had to say no." And then Gia said, "Maybe you should have done it before. This is the first time you said no to me." Shortly afterwards, Kathleen washed her hands of the situation, turning it over to Joe. Now, Joe had always indulged and helped and rescued Gia, who now worked off and on for him in his sandwich shop business. The family and Rochelle convinced Gia to go to inpatient treatment, and she went to Eagleville Rehab after declaring herself indigent. Out of all her earnings, she only had $2,500 left. Shortly after her admission, her Aunt Barbara, this is Kathleen's next youngest sister, was killed in an automobile accident. Barbara had always been a buffer between Kathleen and Gia. She was free-spirited with a way of bringing people together. The family was in shock. Gia left Eagleville Rehab to be with the family for 10 days, staying with Kathleen. Then she went on to Atlantic City to be with Rochelle, who didn't push rehab now. Kathleen and Nancy were pointing fingers at each other, but in February '85, they united to go to Atlantic City and bring Gia back to Eagleville. It was a long-term program with confrontational groups. There, off of the drugs, Gia became quite depressed. She became very attached to another patient, Rob Fay. This is she, Gia and Rob. Her counselor at Eagleville noted, quotes, "I don't think she and her mom could separate each other out. They were sort of enmeshed, and Gia was very unhappy with that. But she also couldn't detach herself." Gia snuck calls to Kathleen and Rochelle from Eagleville. Nancy moved to Atlantic City and was living with Rochelle. At Eagleville, it was as if Gia's therapist had 4 patients in one. This is a quote from one of her therapists. Gia had a very pressured kind of relationship with these 3 women who seemed to be the most important women in her life: her mother, her aunt, and her lover. So that would be Kathleen, Nancy, and Rochelle. These were 3 very aggressive women trying to get Gia to do what they wanted. It was a lot of women fighting about her, not because she was a star or anything. I think it was because she was so much like a baby. She wasn't like an adult. She was like a child. She would deal with things in her life and take care of herself as best she could. But emotionally, she was a little girl, and I think that elicited a lot from people like the "I want to take care of her" thing. End of the quote. Kathleen called a lot, wanting to know what was going on. Some therapists complained about her. One, however, said, quote, "This is a woman who loved her daughter, but didn't quite know how to deal with what was going on. It's true of any family with an addicted member. Now, she's certainly a very pushy woman, and Gia was completely the opposite. I could imagine Gia sitting there quietly and her mother pushing her around. On the women's unit, we did a lot of work on mothers. I think Gia's tears were about not having what she wanted from her mother, feeling abandoned by her mother. What I try to do with people is to get them to understand the other person's position. But she was still, why did this happen to me?" End of the quote. Kathleen said, "Everyone who dealt with us thought we were very tied together, constantly switching mother and daughter roles." End quote. Kathleen felt herself being analyzed and attacked, a process she never recalled agreeing to. "The intense sensation started to bring up all these things inside of me," she said. "Everything. All the reasons why I thought I needed help in my own life. Things that had happened, the religion, my mother, my sisters, and somewhere inside of me, this voice says, 'Yo, Kathleen, if you don't cut this shit out, you're not going to know who's who.' So I put a stop to it. My mother said, 'You don't have to do this.' And I said, 'Thank you, Mother. Finally, after all these years of my married adult life, you tell me something I can do.'" This is still Kathleen talking. "I guess Gia really did expect too much from me. I always felt she was never going to be happy until she had me totally 100% for herself. She always created situations where I had to devote it all to her. But there were times when she took care of me and I took care of her. It switched back and forth. There were times when each of us tried to break away. There's a separation you should make from parents to become an adult, and the other always blocked them. She would tell me what to do. She gave me a reason to pull myself together. She would have a way of making me get mad and pull my act together if I felt I wasn't getting the credit I deserved. She just kept me stirred." In September 1985, Gia completed the program and moved off campus into a group apartment and got a job. Within 2 months, she was back living with Kathleen against the wishes of her counselors. After Christmas '85, Gia began to have fungus symptoms and became worried about AIDS. In the winter, she began using again and sneaking out to meet Rochelle. In June of '86, she was hospitalized in Philly with pneumonia and diagnosed HIV positive and with AIDS-related complex. At that time, there were fewer than 750 females with AIDS in the United States. After she was stabilized medically, She was transferred to psychiatry and treated with lithium. Her hospital chart is noted that, quotes, her mother is acting like she has it too. Kathleen suggested to Gia that she could kill them both in her car as she was feeling her life was over too. Gia was becoming more isolated. So that's why I put this circle around Gia and Kathleen. Her maternal grandmother wouldn't visit and wouldn't let Barbara's son come to visit. Henry didn't want Gia to come home. Gia made arrangements to stay with a friend of Rob Fay's, Dawn Phillips. Henry changed his mind after his office was okay with the AIDS diagnosis, but Gia went ahead with her plan and stayed with Dawn Phillips. It's a picture of Gia and Dawn. Gia got sicker, spent more time at home, and eventually moved back with Kathleen and Henry. Not many people stayed in contact with her. Rob, Dawn, and some Eagleville counselors. When Way Bandy, a makeup artist she had known in New York, died of AIDS, no one called her. Her old friend and lover was in touch by phone. Kathleen didn't give Gia messages from Nancy and Rochelle when they called. Rochelle was in the depths of her own addiction, and Gia decided she had no place in Rochelle's life. So again, this isolation of Kathleen and Gia in a kind of cocoon. Gia was seeing a counselor at the mental health center who said, quotes, the biggest thing she was trying to do was to put to rest her relationship with her mother. She was desperately trying to find the good in it. One of Gia's last letters to Kathleen says, dearest Mom, the world has been hard on me these past years. I know it hasn't been easy for you either. I never intentionally meant to cause you any sorrow. It destroys me when I do, because I love you more than any other thing. You are my favorite human being. Thank you for being my mom. Sincerely yours. Love, Gia. Kathleen and Henry were arguing a lot with Gia and monitoring every cent she spent. They wanted control of her money, her food stamps. Gia told Nancy she thought Kathleen and Henry were worried they would end up with the medical bills. In October of '86, Gia was admitted to Hahnemann Hospital. Kathleen took complete control, monitoring all the information and visitors. Again, this isolated cocoon. She barred Rochelle and most of Gia's other friends. Rob Fay was allowed to visit. He spent a lot of time with Gia, cuddling with her in bed and watching TV. Joe Sr. came almost every day, often with Michael or Joey. Nancy questioned whether Kathleen really loved Gia, but Gia's counselor saw it as the way Kathleen loved Gia and her difficulty loving Gia in a way that helped her. For example, Kathleen and Gia had agreed ahead of time on no extreme measures. But when Gia was actually dying, Kathleen pushed her into signing new consent forms for life support. Although Gia said, thank you very much for making my decision for me, she signed the forms. And when her condition worsened, Gia was placed on a respirator and remained on it for a month. Doctors pleaded with Kathleen to discontinue it, and Gia wrote notes indicating she wanted to die. All her organ systems failed. Kathleen allowed no one outside the family to see her the last week of her life out of her concern for how Gia looked. In fact, Gia and Kathleen had a pact that if Gia didn't look her best when she was embalmed, that Kathleen would not permit an open casket. Gia died with Kathleen in the room reading the 23rd Psalm. The undertaker suggested they keep the death quiet and not do an obituary in New York City. There was only one obituary in one Philadelphia paper. The casket was closed, which upset Joe Sr. Kathleen let some people know, but they didn't come out of their anger with Kathleen. No one from the fashion industry attended her funeral. Joey's daughter, age 13, moved in with Kathleen and Henry the day Gia died and began taking acting and modeling classes. Never have found out what happened to her. In April of '88, AM Philadelphia did a segment on AIDS, and Kathleen called in saying, "You are just scratching the surface. My daughter died of AIDS." When they realized she was speaking about Gia, they asked her to come in and do a show. And that was the beginning of what turned into Stephen Fried's book. Henry moved out not long before the show. He wanted Kathleen to take down all the pictures of the covers. Kathleen says, "I couldn't let go, and he wanted me to let go. It bothered him. I was as upset as I was. When she died, I felt like a big chunk of me was ripped away." Henry did come back later, and they reconciled. Joe Sr. became ill with inoperable brain cancer in August of '88, about a year and a half after Gia died, and he died 2 weeks later. Michael tried to take over the last luncheonette remaining from Joe's business. Squabbles between the children of Joe's 3 marriages made the transition impossible, and it was closed with 2 framed photos of Gia over the grill. Now I have a few conclusion slides, and then we'll go to the discussion. So again, I just want to reiterate this nuclear family emotional process around Gia, distance and conflict between Joe and Kathleen. Kathleen very over-involved and inconsistent and indulgent with Gia. Joe indulgent, permissive, rescuing, distant, and critical. And Henry in a similar position, distant and critical when he comes into the picture. We know one of the central issues about Bowen theory is that it's about too much. It's about this over-involvement of the mother and child, and the way the mother's giving of self programs a need for love in the offspring. Or another way to show it would be these circles with Kathleen having a little more self than Gia, and Gia having very little, and Gia very embedded in the relationship with Kathleen and unable to really separate out her own self from Kathleen. This is one of the hardest parts of Bowen theory, that it's about the level of intensity in the relationship between the people, and it doesn't really matter whether it shows as love or hate. For Kathleen and Gia, it's circled between love and hate. They would have a lot of conflict, and they would have a lot of intense ooey gooey togetherness, and it would vacillate. And from a Bowen theory perspective, that doesn't make any difference. Those are 2 sides of the same coin of an intense relationship. And lastly, in terms of Bowen theory and attachment theory, Bowen theory's conception of the feelings, the subjective feelings of rejection and deprivation, is that you have an intense relationship, you have conflict that develops, either chronic or acute, and the people wall off from each other to protect themselves. And if you stop the video at this point in time, it does subjectively feel like rejection and distance, but it's a product of this whole process. What I like to say is, this is a video, not a still shot. And this still shot is part of a video that involves an intense relationship. Just a few more slides and I'll quit for the discussion. Is it too much or is it too little? It's amusing to me that towards the end of the book, after presenting all these marvelous quotes, which to me substantiate the intense involvement of Kathleen and Gia, Fried suggests that perhaps it was maternal deprivation. Again, from a Bowen theory perspective, it's symbiosis. This is not pathology in Kathleen or in Gia. It's a reciprocal, enmeshed relationship in which Kathleen is as tied up in the relationship as Gia is. And it involves the primary triangle reciprocity, which leaves Gia and Kathleen stuck together with the male in a distant critical process. And of course, with as much information as I have about the multi-generational transmission process, there are suggestions that these people did not come from the most mature families. And the replication of the intense attachment with other people, we see with Gia looking for a mother, looking for a relationship like she had with Kathleen in her relationship with Wilhelmina Cooper, with Lizette Catan, with Monique Pollard, and how these people played out the other side of trying to take care of her. And Gia, having achieved very little separation in her original family, achieves very little separation in her other relationships. The description of her romantic relations and how quickly she gets in over her head, how involved she is, how overwhelmed she is with the relationship, and how demanding she is of the other. And favorable relationships support functioning. When she's first being successful in New York, she's got a network of relationships that are supporting her. She's not too dysfunctional. But then when relationship with Wilhelmina disrupts, then her functioning really dribbles off the court. And briefly, I just want to talk about addiction. That addiction, from a Bowen theory perspective, is seen as an overlay on a basic symbiosis. It's a method of managing chronic anxiety. And it involves a kind of denial of dependency and a position of being estranged from the family, which Gia did take with other people. She would present, despite this constant ongoing contact with her family, she would present herself as estranged from her family. And Gia's addiction becomes a bigger problem within 10 months of moving to New York City. She's away from her family, she's away from her mother. I don't think that that's an accident. And it becomes extremely worse after the loss of Wilhelmina Cooper. So that is all the slides. I'm going to stop sharing and go to Q&A.